Hi folks, one last visit this week to Matthew 5 and the early part of the Sermon on the Mount before the lectionary jumps next week on the Sunday before Lent to the Transfiguration, and then jumps all the way back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry and the temptation. So we ended last week with the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and being better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and we pick up on that now, Matthew 5. Verses 21 to 37. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, 'Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce.' But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." And so we ended last week with Jesus saying that his kingdom community really was being watched by the world, and so needed to be salt of the earth and light of the world. But he then went on to say that third thing, that we needed to be better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. We're not just forgiven people, we're people on a journey of transformation. And this week's passage puts flesh and blood on these bones. In these verses, Jesus gives us specific examples of how we're meant to be better than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Jesus does this by taking lots of examples from the Jewish law, one or two of them from the Ten Commandments. And you've probably noticed there was a kind of formula in each of those four sections of the reading. First, there's a statement that goes along the lines of, "You have heard that it was said long ago." And then Jesus quotes the commandment or law in particular. And then he says, "But I say to you." And then he proceeds to add up the ante and make that law even more challenging than it was in the Old Testament. And that formula, you have heard that it was told, but I tell you, wasn't unique to Jesus. A number of rabbis used it. They were saying, well, you've heard a certain interpretation of the law, but now I'm going to tell you the real deep interpretation of it. And Jesus, above all, had the right to say that. What's he trying to get over? That it's not enough just to obey the law externally. What God is looking for is more than external actions. He's looking at our character. Now, that said, it's quite easy to see the kind of character faults that Jesus is addressing in each of these 4 sections, but what I'd like to do as we think about them is turn it round so that what we're going for are the positive qualities that Jesus clearly wants to see in our characters instead. So let's go through the 4. Firstly, when Jesus talks about the command not to murder, he identifies anger, putting people down, and broken relationships as character faults behind the outward action, and similar to murder. The positive quality he identifies here is reconciliation. That's what's important for us here. Be reconciled to the person who has something against you before you go to worship together. Be reconciled to your adversary who's taking you to court. And we know how reconciliation fits in with wider Christian theology, don't we? We know and we believe that God reconciled us to himself through Christ at the cross, but that it's not just a private thing. Having been reconciled to God, we must be reconciled to one another, and the church is a community of reconciliation. In the Methodist Church, we even reflect that a little bit in some of our denominational structures. If there has been a complaint against someone at local level and it can't be resolved to the satisfaction of both parties there, it gets referred up to our district to look at it, and the group in our district who try to resolve these problems is called the District Reconciliation Group. That's their goal. And so it's a shame then that some people in our churches would rather complain about somebody and assassinate someone's character, or even make up false accusations. I've known all those things happen. And that the people would rather do that than seek reconciliation. And after I first wrote those words in my preparation, I looked at those words, character assassination, and I thought, yeah, no wonder Jesus links all these attitudes under murder. When I call for reconciliation, I'm not asking that we sweep differences or pain under the carpet. That's not reconciliation. Of course, it can be difficult. It can be downright painful to effect a reconciliation. Sometimes the two estranged parties can't just do it themselves together. They need a mediator who can help, and trained and skilled mediators particularly can be a great blessing here. But make no mistake, reconciliation is core to who we are as the Christian church. If we undermine it, or if we despise it, then we're undermining our very identity as the church. We become then not a place of life, but a place of death, because we're committing moral murder. Secondly, when Jesus talks about adultery and the adultery of the heart that is lust, he is calling us to the positive character trait of contentment. For what Jesus is doing here is linking the commandment not to commit adultery with the commandment not to covet. If a man lusts after another woman, he's lusting after someone else's spouse or partner or daughter. And Jesus doesn't, of course, refer here just to passing attraction, but the deliberate harbouring or desire for an illicit relationship. When we're not content with our possessions, we covet buying more. When we're not content in our relationships, we may covet someone else. One of the problems we have with relationships today, and I think I've said this before, is that in the absence of belief in God, we expect too much of our romantic partners. We expect them to fulfill all kinds of needs, not just the physical ones, but emotional ones too. We place a heavy burden on them that really only God can fill. So when our loved ones fail to meet all our needs, the seeds of discontent can be sown. And as those seeds grow, they burst through the surface of the soil as weeds that strangle our contentment. We begin to think maybe someone else would suit us better. Well, it's a delusion. It doesn't work. And if the thought is allowed to proceed to action, then 2 families can be destroyed. As the church, we need to be the community that resists the lies of the world that say that we shall only be satisfied with more, and better. It bankrupts our bank accounts and it breaks up our families and our relationships. Betrayed spouses may take years before they ever trust someone again. Children suffer in their upbringing despite the heroics of many lone parents. I've quoted before in weddings the old saying that a bride's aspirations on her wedding day can be summed up in 3 words, and this is a pun: I'll alter him. But we need to accept one another's imperfections and failings, showing some of the grace that God has shown to us. We need to be less concerned with changing them for the better, and that if they don't change, we'll exchange them for a better and newer model, than actually with changing ourselves. Thirdly, when Jesus talks about divorce, the positive character trait he has in mind is faithfulness. We do have to read Jesus' words in parallel here, because what he says here about except for sexual immorality, he says again and underlines it a bit more in Matthew chapter 19, and we also have to bear in mind what the Apostle Paul says in the first letter to the Corinthians chapter 7, where he talks about a Christian married to a non-Christian, and that if the non-Christian is unhappy and wants out, then the Christian perhaps should accept the divorce. But given that there are extreme exceptions, the ideal is still one man and one woman exclusively for life. The New Testament scholar Craig Keener says that Jesus and Paul exonerate those who genuinely wished to save their marriage but were unable to do so because of their spouse's unrepentant adultery, abandonment, or abuse that destroyed the marriage bond. Jesus, in his typical use of extreme or hyperbolic language, as we call it, is not here sending abused wives back to their abusers, as I've sadly heard 1 or 2 Christian ministers say, but he's calling on those who've done the wrong to mend their ways. The other week at my Byfleet church, we hosted a wedding blessing for another church, a church that didn't have its own premises. And as their pastor took the lovely young couple through their vows, I noticed that when he asked them all the traditional questions, like, will you be faithful to her, to him, so long as you both shall live? Their answer was, I will. Now, that's fine, up to a point. I will indicates that they're making a promise that extends into the future, and I will, I think, also means it's going to be an active will at times. When I don't feel like it, I'm still going to do the right, faithful thing. Yet, for all that, I prefer the Methodist marriage service, where the couples don't just say, I will, as they realise in the vows that marriage can be tough sometimes. They say, with God's help, I will. Because, especially for those times when it's tough to be faithful, God promises the help of his Holy Spirit. And this isn't just about marriage. It's about us in the church being faithful to Jesus and his teachings, and be faithful in being committed to one another in community. So, does Jesus see that faithfulness to him and his teaching and to one another in our kingdom community? Fourthly and finally, when Jesus asks about whether or not you should swear an oath in court, he has in mind the positive character trait of integrity. Jesus' banning of oaths wasn't a unique position, but it was quite rare. And of course there are examples in the Old Testament of oaths being taken that were expected to be kept, and there are also, alongside those, examples of foolish oaths. The intention behind Jesus' teaching is probably similar to the ancient Greek view that your word should be as good as your oath. It makes me think of my late father's experience. He worked in banking in the City of London. And when the so-called Big Bang happened in the financial world in 1987, my father bemoaned the fact that what disappeared overnight from the culture was a notion that a gentleman's word was his bond. So much business had been conducted in the city on a well-founded basis that if someone gave their word, they would keep it. A handshake sealed the commitment of both parties. But this was replaced by lies and suspicion that had to be kept in check by laws and regulations. Jesus is calling his people to be so known for their commitment to truthfulness that our reputation means that no one needs to ask us to back it up in some legal way. He calls us to remember that when we speak, we do so not merely in the presence of human witnesses, but in the presence of God. Yet, how much do we actually live our lives in the recognition that God is present? Should that not have an effect on our commitment to truth? In Jesus' day, some people thought it okay to break an oath and deceive people if they swore their oath on something trivial, like their right hand, for example. But Jesus wants his people to be different. In our day, we know how easily some people find it to engage in barefaced deceit. Sadly, and especially in perhaps the last couple of years, we have had too many examples of that in Parliament. But politics is not the only arena where we've witnessed this disturbing trend. Some people think they can say anything they like on the internet and that there'll be no consequences. They can get away with it. They can be a keyboard warrior hiding behind a screen. They're wrong. So if Jesus calls us to be people who are habitually known for their truth-telling, it's another way in which he is calling us to be distinctive in the face of the watching world. The same is true of the other character virtues we've been thinking about in this passage. His call to faithfulness comes to us in a society that has replaced lifetime faithfulness with what we call serial monogamy. I'll be faithful to one person for a while, then I'll give it up, then I'll choose another. Or now, of course, what the media is calling throuples or polyamory. And Jesus' call to contentment, comes to us in a society where we are forever meant to buy bigger and better things, regardless of whether we need them, relationships included. His call to reconciliation comes to us in a society where we seem to have imbibed the American disease of, if it moves, sue it. How is God calling me to be distinctive as a Christian today? How is God calling us as a church to be distinctive? How indeed shall we be the light of the world? And I'll leave you with that thought and hope that you'll be able to join again next week. God bless you. Bye-bye.